Today is going to be a doozy, so we're going to jump in and see what ground we can cover. We're going to be doing like we did last week, and we're going to hit all four Gospels, telling the story of Golgotha. So last week we looked at a few things about Gethsemane. This week our second stop in the journey from Gethsemane to Golgotha is Golgotha itself. And next week we'll look at beyond, which is of course the empty tomb. But before we get into it, what things do you know, or do you think you know, about the crucifixion scene leading up to it? What are some things we've always been taught and we've always just kind of accepted, whether it's in here or not? So who carried the cross? Jesus, part of the way.
Yeah.
And then what happened?
Somebody out the crowd.
He fell, and the Roman, from my understanding, the Roman soldiers gave the cross to, what was the guy's name? Who carried it for him?
Yeah, Simon the Cyrenian.
Yeah.
That is actually in all four Gospels. We'll see so that is a definite detail that is accurate. One of the Gospels tells us the names of his two sons. I used to sing that song, Watch the Lamb, at Easter. It talks about the two little boys. Well, they're named in one of the Gospels. So that's one thing that's definitely something we all know of. What other details?
Well, prior to all that, Jesus was whipped or beaten.
Yeah, he was whipped and scourged and all that.
Scourged, yeah, that's the word.
Everybody kept handing him off. Nobody wanted to make a decision.
Yeah, prior to that, they didn't want to deal with it, so they just kind of kept passing him off. He ended up with Pilate. Pilate passed the sentence reluctantly. But then he's got the cross. He heads to the cross. There's a bunch of different things that happen. And we'll kind of look at this as maybe like an investigative account today, to look at all the details spread throughout the four Gospels so that we can put together the story accurately. Because there's a lot of thoughts that we have of what did he say when he was on the cross, what was the last thing he said, what did they do, when did he have the vinegar, did he drink the vinegar, what women were there, who was there, who rolled the stone over the tomb. Who do y'all think rolled the stone over the tomb? That's what I've always taught. That's not true. We'll find out who actually rolled the stone over the tomb today. We've had this book our whole lives, and I have too. And just this week, I've seen some of the details I've seen really for the first time.
Those things don't think that you think
Yeah, because we hear things, we assume things.
Yeah.
So let's look at what the Bible says about Golgotha. So we're going to start in Matthew 27. So we're going to be in Matthew 27, Mark 15, Luke 23, and then John 19. We'll go through all four accounts, and we won't hit every detail, obviously, we don't have time. But I have identified roughly 15 or 16 kind of things in each gospel account that are common to what we, think and know of this story. So the first thing about it is Matthew 27, the whole account is verse 32 all the way to verses 61. Again, we're not going to cover every single verse, but we'll hit some of the main points. And we see in verse 32, this is after the whole thing with Pilate, and they stripped him and put a scarlet robe on him and the crown of thorns on his head, and making fun of him and all that. That's back up in 28 and 29 and 30. But as we get down to his actual journey walking to the cross, we see in verse 32 that they found a man of Cyrene, Simon by name, and they compelled him to bear his cross. So when they were come to a place called Golgotha, that is to say, a place of a skull, all four accounts mention that as well. They gave him vinegar to drink mingled with gall. I think Mark says myrrh, which is the same type of substance. It's a natural painkiller, basically, that they tried to give him. And when he had tasted it, he would not drink. So we know that he resisted that numbing sensation. He wanted to experience the full brunt of the sin of the world. He didn't want anybody to be able to come back and say he was trying to, make it a little easier for himself or nothing like that. So for whatever reason, we just speculate, he did not drink of this concoction that they came up with. So we see that. We see in verse 35 that they cast lots for his vesture, his garments. It says they crucified him, parted his garments, casting lots that may be fulfilled as spoken of the prophet. They parted my garments among them, and upon my vesture did they cast lots. Anybody know what that is a fulfillment of? What scripture that is, or where it's found? Psalm 22:18 is a prophetical statement that said this was going to happen, and it did. I love verse 36. I did a whole sermon on this one time. It says, "And sitting down, they watched him there." I mean, that's pretty profound. Just to think of the crowd, and they sit there and they're watching. Okay, what's going to happen here? So timeline-wise, we'll learn throughout the process of this. When did they nail Jesus on the cross? What time of day was it? You may know. 9 in the morning.
Yeah.
So one of the Gospels says it was the 3rd hour. So their day starts at 6 a.m. So that's hour 1. So the 3rd hour would be 9 a.m.
And he was dead by,
3 p.m.
Yeah.
So he was on the cross for 6 hours.
yeah. Because they wanted to bury him before.
Right,
sunset.
before 6 o'clock. Yeah.
Jewish custom.
And that's how we know that he was crucified on Friday. A lot of people debate that and argue about the 72 hours between this and that. We know it was Friday because Saturday is the Sabbath for the Jews, still today. And Sabbath begins at 6 p.m. Friday evening. So they were rushing to get him off the cross and in the tomb before 6 p.m. Friday evening, because beginning 6 p.m. Friday begins the Sabbath for the Jews, even still today. So that's how we know for a fact he was crucified on Friday, not on Thursday, as a lot of people try to speculate. Some people push it to Wednesday for some reason, but it was definitely Friday. So we see here he has a superscription put above his head. There's a sign posted that said, "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." And then we get the story of the 2 thieves, and that's in verse 38. There were 2 thieves crucified with him, one on the right hand, the other on the left. And then we see from verse 39 down to 44 that many people mocked him. They made fun of him. They were saying things like, well, if he saved all these other people, why don't he save himself? If he did all these miracles, and if he says he's the Son of God, why doesn't he get himself down off the cross? And they're just basically mocking him and just poking fun at him. In verse 44, this is interesting, because we get a different story in Luke. We get a fuller story, not a different story. In Luke, we get the story of one thief is railing on him. The other one tells him to hush, that they're up there because they deserve it. Jesus hadn't done anything wrong. And then he makes that great statement, "Remember me when you enter into your kingdom," which got the guy saved. Because Jesus looked at him and said, "Verily, verily, I say unto you, today you will be with me in paradise."
Talk about your luck turning around.
Yeah, exactly. Your whole situation turns in a split second. All we get in Matthew is verse 44. The thieves also, which were crucified with him, cast the same in his teeth. That means they also joined in with the crowd mocking him. That's all it says in Matthew and in Mark. Kind of interesting. Verse 45 is where we get the story of the darkness. It says, "Now from the 6th hour there was darkness all over the land until the 9th hour." So understanding what time of the day, what time does the Jewish day start? 6 a.m., right? So 6 hours from then is when? 3 o'clock. 6 hours from 6 a.m. is noon, right? So from the 6th hour, which is noontime, from 6 a.m., count forward 6 hours, that's 12 noon. There was darkness all over the land until the 9th hour, and that's 3 p.m. So from 6 to 3, from 12 to 3, everything turned pitch black. And, a lot of people try to explain that as it was a solar eclipse or whatever. There's not, we're getting ready to experience that on April 8th, Zachary's birthday. So we called in a big birthday present for Zachary this year. It happens very quickly. And how long does a solar eclipse last? Even in the...
It's not 3 hours.
No, it's more like
It's
maybe
30
3,
minutes.
maybe
minutes.
pure darkness, maybe 3 minutes.
Yeah.
But the whole, process maybe 30 minutes or something like that. But yeah, so that doesn't explain the 3 hours of pitch darkness. That's just a supernatural effect that occurred. But for 3 hours it was dark, so at 3 o'clock is when he dies. We see here, verse 46, about the 9th hour, Jesus cried with a loud voice. That's significant to the other Gospels, because Luke, we'll get there with John, just says that he cried with a loud voice. It doesn't say what he said. But here it says he cried with a loud voice, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, which is a Greek phrase that says, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? It says, and some that stood there when they had heard it said, this man calls for Elias. So they misinterpreted what he said. They heard Eli, Eli, they thought he was hollering for Elijah to come back, because there's prophecy and different ideas that Elijah would one day return. Of course, who came back as a type of Elijah that Jesus acknowledged? John the Baptist. He is the fulfillment of that prophecy of a man like Elijah returning. That was John the Baptist. By this point, he's already beheaded and dead. But they were saying, he's calling for Elijah. And somebody tries to bring him some more of this vinegar mix, and somebody stopped him. In verse 48 there it says, the rest said, in verse 49 it says, the rest said, let be, let us see whether Elias come to save him. Elias is just another way of saying Elijah. And then verse 50, it says, when he had cried again with a loud voice, he yielded up the ghost. That means his spirit left him. Which is weird for me to get a full grasp of that, because the Holy Spirit and Jesus and God are all the same. I can't really explain that fully. But we do know when human beings die, we leave our body. We are not what we see each other as. We are the person that lives inside the body. Paul and Peter both talk about one day we must put off this tent and then go to, continue to exist in heaven, or in hell, depending on your belief system before you left. So yielding up the ghost just means that the person of who he was in the vessel left the body, and he literally died. And then at that moment, as soon as that occurred, that's when God opened the access for us to be able to come to him without an earthly priest, because Jesus is now the high priest. Because what did Jesus do? He went, his own blood, we read about this in Hebrews, his own blood was put on the altar, the mercy seat of the Ark of the Covenant, to make atonement for the sin of the entire world. Now, I can't give you all the details about that either. It's beyond my understanding. But that's what the Bible states. When Jesus' blood was applied to the mercy seat of what the system that God set up to be redeemed back to him, that was the ultimate work of the ultimate high priest, being Jesus. And at that point, there's no need for the earthly temple anymore, the structure anymore. We are now the temple of God, because God lives in us through the Holy Spirit. But the physical building is not needed anymore, and that's why verse 51 says, and behold, the veil of the temple was rent in twain or two from the top to the bottom. Now, if you've ever seen this veil, it's thick and heavy. It's multiple inches thick, really, really tall. And it's basically impossible for a human to get up there and do that. This was an act of God That thing ripped from the top of God coming down to us to the bottom, exposing the Holy of Holies, which no one was allowed into. But at this point, there's no need for anyone to go into the Holy of Holies because Jesus is now doing the work on our behalf in place of a human being. That's the biggest point of the book of Hebrews, is Jesus is now the high priest. So that occurs. Now we get a story here following that we get nowhere else. This is the only account of this story. When the temple was open, and this is weird. I had to read this several times to get this. A lot of people think at this moment, these dead people came up out of the graves and walked into the city. But that's not what it says. If you read what it says, and the graves were opened, and many bodies of the saints which slept arose, and came out of the graves after his resurrection, and went into the holy city, and appeared to many. So for some reason, there's this little story that's pulled in here that doesn't happen for 3 more days. Anybody got any thoughts on that? Of why it's placed right there?
Why it's placed there, I don't know, but he's to be the first, he was the first resurrection.
Right, he was the first resurrection.
These had to come after.
Exactly. So, and it states very clearly after his resurrection. So this did not occur when the temple was, when the veil of the temple was rent. This occurred after Jesus was resurrected from the dead. But it's interesting that he just plugs that in there. And then he continues with the story back at the cross. So it's a little weird that that's just kind of right there. But a lot of people put that out of context, I guess, because it's right there. But he goes on in verse 54 to talk about the story of the centurion. They were watching him. They saw the earthquake and those things that were done. They feared greatly. And the centurion guard said, truly, this was the Son of God. Verse 55 and 56 tell us about the women who were at the cross. So let's look carefully at what Matthew tells us. It says, many women were there beholding afar off, which followed Jesus from Galilee, ministering unto him. Among which, who have we always thought was there?
His mother.
His mother. We always get that.
And Mary and Martha, probably.
Okay. So what this tells us is Mary Magdalene, which was the lady possessed with 7 demons, and Jesus brought those demons out, and Mary, the mother of James and Joseph.
Is that not Jesus'
Yes,
brothers?
it is. And the mother of Zebedee's children. Her name is Salome. So who's Zebedee? There he goes.
I'm struggling.
So Zebedee is the father of James and John, the disciples, the fishermen. So Salome is his wife and their mother. So she is mentioned by name in some of the other Gospels. Here it just says the mother of Zebedee's children. So we all know who Mary Magdalene is. She's mentioned in all 4 Gospels very plainly. The 4 Gospels kind of split words about Jesus' mother, Mary. Here calls her Mary, the mother of James and Joseph. Now we know that this is Mary, the mother of Jesus, from 2 places in the Bible. Matthew 13:55. So Matthew 13:55, the people are standing around debating about the legitimacy of Jesus, basically. And they ask the question, is this not the carpenter's son? That's how we know Joseph was a carpenter. Is not his mother called Mary? And his brethren, James and Joseph and Simon and Judas? So he had 4 half-brothers by Mary. And this says, Mary, the mother of James and Joseph. That's 2 of those 4 names. We also see the same thing in Mark 6:3. Mark 6:3 phrases it a little different. It says, is this not the carpenter, the son of Mary? So they call Jesus a carpenter in this statement. the brother of James and Joseph and Judah and Simon. So they called him Judas in Matthew 13 and Judah in Mark 6, but the same person. And are not his sisters here with us? So we know he had at least 2 sisters. So he had siblings. So this reference, Mary, the mother of James and Joseph, is simply Jesus' mother. And they mention 2 of his other 4 half-brothers there. So, 3 women, right? Mary Magdalene, Mary Jesus' mother, and Salome is her name, the mother of Zebedee's children. So those are the 3 women at the cross. Good? Pretty clear on that with that passage. Now, I'm nailing that down because as we move forward, it gets a little, people start losing their brain on it. But we'll get there in a minute. And then moving on, verses 57 to 60, we see the story of Joseph of Arimathea. It says, when even was come, there came a rich man of Arimathea named Joseph, who also himself was Jesus' disciple. He went to Pilate, begged for the body of Jesus, and Pilate commanded the body to be delivered. And when Joseph had taken the body, he wrapped it in a clean linen cloth. Here's the verse that tells us who put the stone over the door. And laid it in his own new tomb. So this was Joseph's tomb that he had prepared for when he died one day, which he had hewn out in the rock. And he rolled a great stone to the door of the sepulchre and departed. So Joseph rolled the stone over the door, not the Roman soldiers. We get this also in Mark. And, verse 61, just to tie it in, and there was Mary Magdalene and the other Mary sitting over against the sepulchre. Who's the other Mary? His mother. Okay, so again, there's Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of Jesus. Salome is somewhere in the mix there. She must have left by this point. Maybe she's tending to John, because John the disciple is Salome's son. So, that makes sense that she would be with him. All right, that's one account. Questions?
Joseph rolled the stone by himself?
Well, it says that he had it done. It says that he rolled a stone to the door of the sepulchre. It may have meant he got people to help him put it there, but he was responsible for it. That's not super clear. So I hate to read into stuff that's not really there, but we can make assumptions that he probably had some help. We know by John's account that Nicodemus was also with him. And if Nicodemus was also with them, we could assume probably because they were 2 really rich people and very powerful people. You would assume there would be people with them. They all probably helped to move the stone over the door. It's not until you get down to verses 64 to 66 that the conversation occurs with Pilate and the Pharisees saying, remember he said after 3 days I'm going to rise again. That's in verse 63. So we suggest we put something there to make sure that the disciples don't come and steal his body in the night and say he was risen from the dead. So that's when verse 64 says that he commanded therefore the sepulchre to be made sure until the 3rd day, lest the disciples come by night and steal him away and say unto the people, he's risen from the dead. Pilate said unto them, ye have a watch, go your way, make it as sure as you can. So they went and made the sepulchre sure, sealing the stone and setting a watch. So the Romans were responsible for sealing it, but Joseph actually put the stone over the door. I never really saw that until I studied this thing. It's pretty cool.
I wonder how you would seal it.
So, I don't know if it's in the Bible at all, but I've heard explanations over the years that they took cords, like ropes, and saturated them in a wet solvent and stuck it in there and wound it and wound it and wound it until that wet pack that they put solidified, and it just created a seal around the door so that it locked the stone in place and you couldn't move it.
So they didn't use Eastman 910.
Yeah, they didn't use foam spray or any of that sort of stuff. They used some type of cord system, from what I understand, studying this stuff out. All right, so there's Matthew's account. Any other questions? We'll jump into Mark's here, if we don't. All right, so Mark, I want to go a little quicker, just point out some of the things. We're going to begin in verse 16. Well, that's where the story begins. It goes all the way to verse 47. Again, I'm going to hit the high points. Mark 15. Mark 15, verses 16 to 47 is the whole story. And I'll just point out the similarities and the slight variances. There are no contradictions, by the way. A lot of people say there's tons of contradictions through these accounts. I don't find them. I just see variations of how the story was told. So, Mark 15, let me take a page back here.
Matthew's account would have been the most detailed, you'd think,
You would
because
think.
he was an accountant, tax collector
Right,
type of
right.
guy.
And Mark's is the earliest, from what we understand. So verse 16, it just starts out, and the soldiers led him away into the hall. They gathered together a whole band, and they clothed him. This is where they put the robe and the crown and all that. If you get down to verse 21, we see Simon a Cyrenian. They compelled one Simon Cyrenian who passed by coming out of the country, the father of Alexander and Rufus, so there we know the two names of his two children, to bear his cross. So that's consistent. And we get some extra details of the names of his kids, and that he had two kids. So that's pretty cool. And they led him to Golgotha, the place of a skull. That is the same as in Matthew. That's verse 22. Verse 23 says they gave him vinegar to drink, but he received it not. This says wine mingled with myrrh. The Matthew account said with gall. It's just a difference in the word, but it's the same purpose. But it says he received it not. Verse 24, and when they had crucified him, they parted his garments, casting lots upon them, what every man should take. So that's consistent. We see there. And verse 25 is where we see the actual time of day, which Matthew did not give us, is when they crucified him. So verse 25 says, and it was the third hour, and they crucified him. That's 9 a.m. So we know for sure what time he was crucified. Verse 26 mentions the sign that was posted. This is Jesus, King of the Jews. Verses 27 and 28 tell us there were two thieves, one on either side. So that's consistent with Matthew's account. Verses 29 to 32, Jesus was mocked by the crowd. And if we look at that, verse 32 says the same thing Matthew said. They that were crucified with him reviled him. So they were joining in the crowd mocking. Something happened to that one thief along the way, though, that he seems to have had a change of heart in the Luke account. Verse 33 tells us, when the 6th hour was come, there was darkness of the whole land till the 9th hour. Again, that's 12 noon to 3 p.m. The 9th hour, Jesus cried with a loud voice. This is slightly different. Matthew said, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, which means, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? Mark records it as Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, but then translates it the same, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? If you look up these words in the Greek, Eli, E-L-I, does mean God. My God is what it translates as. Eloi means my defender, literally, but he's referring to God as his defender. God has had his hand on him the whole time he's been on the earth. They tried to kill him, I don't know how many times, at least 10, probably more than that, and he's always gotten away. So I don't think that's a contradiction, but it is a slight variation in the text. I don't have a problem with that, unless y'all do. I still don't have a problem with it if you do, but just pointing out that there is a slight difference there. Verse 36, he talks about, the crowd says he's calling for Elijah. It's the same story. Verse 37, we get where he dies, he passes away. It says, and Jesus cried with a loud voice and gave up the ghost. So he cried with a loud voice twice. according to these two accounts. One, he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? And then he cries out with a loud voice again later, and he yields up the ghost. We don't know what he says, according to Matthew and Mark, during that second loud voice that he cries out with. But we do know that's the moment that he died. Verse 38 says the temple was rent in two from top to the bottom. Same thing that Matthew said. We do not get the account of the earthquake and the graves opening and all that, which would make sense because it didn't occur sequentially in the events that were happening in this moment. That's something that happened 3 days later. For some reason, Matthew decided to add that in the midst of his story. But we don't get that part of it. We do get the centurion, verse 39 says, surely this was the Son of God. And then here we get to the women mentioned at the crucifixion, verse 40. So here it says, there were also women looking on afar off, that's consistent with Matthew, among whom was Mary Magdalene, and then Mary, the mother of James the Less. So we know that James was called also James the Less, which clues us in a bit that he was one of the 12 disciples. Because they had Big James and James the Less. They had two Jameses in the group. So they call one of them, which is John's brother, Big James. The other James, they called him Little James, or James the Less. Which means that one of Jesus's half-brothers was one of the 12 disciples. I mean, it's right there. Whether we like that or not, or are okay with that or not, it's right there. And we know that Mary was his mother. Mary was the mother of James the Less. So Matthew and Mark, between the two, we can learn that James, and we know that James the Less was considered one of the 12 disciples. That they're talking about Jesus' mother there. And then it says, and James the Less and Joseph, mentions Joseph there again. Joseph is another name for Joseph. Probably Joseph Jr., because the dad was most likely Joseph. So James and Joseph, but he's called James the Less there. And Salome. So we know that Salome was the wife of Zebedee because it was the mother of Zebedee's children, James and John. So we can piece all that together to figure out who she is and what her name is. So again, we still have how many women? 3. Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of Jesus, and Salome, the mother of James and John. So that's pretty much settles that for me between those two Gospels. Then we go on, we see in verses 43 down to 46 the story of Joseph of Arimathea. Also says in verse 46, speaking of Joseph, it says that he bought fine linen, took him down, wrapped him in the linen, laid him in a sepulchre which was hewn out of a rock, and rolled a stone unto the door of the sepulchre. So this gospel also says that Joseph is the one that had the stone rolled. Then it mentions verse 47, Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of Joseph beheld where he was laid. Again, that's Jesus' mother. Then, this is interesting, we'll jump into chapter 16 a bit for verse 1. It says, when the Sabbath was passed, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, they switched between James and Joseph. I was talking to Joy about this last night. I feel kind of bad for Judas and Simon. They were never mentioned. It must have been the bad sheep of the family or something, the two of them. But they're never mentioned by name here. And Salome. So again, these same 3 women are mentioned here as being at the tomb. Or it says when the Sabbath day was passed, Mary Magdalene, the mother of James and Salome, had brought, and that's when the resurrection, of course, occurred, or had already occurred. But again, just piecing together some of the information. All right, let's move on, unless you got questions.
I just find it interesting they always mention Mary Magdalene first.
Yeah. I mean, it's like, boom.
Yeah.
But she was like, that was her life. Once, he got the 7 demons out of her, she's right there by his side doing whatever he needed done.
You can imagine, though, if you were
right
present and somebody that was absolutely totally nuts,
Yeah,
all of a sudden they became,
yeah.
Totally
She was
different.
that grateful
That
that
was
she
like
was
a
literally by
real
his side
impression
all
on
the
me.
time. But it is interesting, yeah, she's always named. Yes, ma'am.
There was many other women that said back
Yeah.
in 41 that came up with him unto Jerusalem. Well, it don't say, it just says they came up with him to Jerusalem.
Right.
So they may or may not have been.
Right, they could have been standing maybe a little farther off. They could have been there with them too, but the names that we get is kind of what is interesting to note there. All right, Luke. We'll go a little more quickly since we're running a little thin on time here. Luke, we get a lot of variation, no contradictions, but we'll hit this quick. We see, starting this off, Luke 23 is where we're at. Verse 26 tells us about Simon the Cyrenian carrying Jesus' cross. We also see a difference in what it says. Instead of it saying that they led them to Golgotha, the place of a skull, they simply call it Calvary. That's where we get the word Calvary from. Calvary is not mentioned in any of the other Gospels, just in Luke. But that's what we most commonly refer to that hill as, is Calvary's Hill. Verse 27 to 31, there's a story added in here. It says that the women were following, lamenting, and Jesus turns and says to them, this is verses 28 down to 31, "Daughters of Jerusalem, weep not for me, but weep for yourselves and your children, for behold, the days are coming, in the which they shall say, Blessed are the barren, and the wombs that have never bare, and the paths which never gave suck. Then shall they begin to say to the mountains, Fall on us, and to the hills, cover us. For if they do these things in a green tree, what shall be done in the dry?" He's talking about the tribulation period, basically, and what's going to happen ultimately to Jerusalem. Of course, he could also be referring to what happened in 70 AD, where the Jerusalem city was destroyed. But a lot of people tie this to Matthew 24 because he says a lot of the same things. It seems to be focused on the 7-year tribulation period as well. So that's new. We didn't get that in the first two Gospels. And then we see verse 36 about the vinegar. Verse 32, there are malefactors there. It kind of jumps around a little bit with the story. So we'll just look at the text here. It says there were two malefactors led with him to be put to death, and they come to the place which is called Calvary. It says that again there. Actually, that's where it says it. Yeah, at Calvary, they crucified him. The malefactors, one on the right, one on the left. Here we get a message where Jesus says, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. That's a new one. That didn't come up in Matthew or Mark, but it doesn't mean it didn't happen. They parted his raiment, cast lot. People stood beholding. They were making fun of him, basically. That's that whole segment. Soldiers are mocking him in verse 36, commanding him and offering him vinegar. Then we see in verse 38, again, this is King of the Jews, and we see here it's noted that it was written in Greek, Latin, and Hebrew. And then we get the story. We already referenced it, so I'll cut it short. But it says, one of the malefactors railed on him, saying, "If you're the Christ, save us." That's what everybody else was saying. But one of them rebuked and said, "We're up here because we deserve to be. This guy's done nothing amiss." Verse 41. And that's when Jesus says, or he said to Jesus, verse 42, "Lord, remember me when you enter into your kingdom." And Jesus said, "Verily, verily, I say unto you today, or verily I say unto you today, today thou shalt be with me in paradise." And then we get the 12 noon to 3 p.m., the 6th hour to the 9th hour is mentioned in verse 44. The veil is rent in the midst. It doesn't say from top to bottom, but it does say in the midst, verse 45. And then here, the other Gospels didn't mention this, but it says he cried with a loud voice. It didn't say what he said. In this Gospel it says he said, "Father, into thy hands I commend my spirit." And having said this, he gave up the ghost. Verse 47 mentions the centurion, except it says he said, certainly this was a righteous man, not son of God, but certainly could still play double duty there because the Son of God is a righteous man. Verse 49, we do not get the names of the women. It just says, and all his acquaintance and the women that followed him from Galilee stood afar off beholding these things. And then we see the story of Joseph of Arimathea. Just looking down. Again, 55 just says, the women also, which came with him from Galilee, followed after and beheld the sepulchre and how his body was laid. No mention of any names there as to who the women were. But they're mentioned, and that's consistent with the other stories. All right, last one. See if we can do this in 3 minutes. John 19. John 19 is the final gospel account. Everything is basically the same. It mentions the place of a skull called in the Hebrew Golgotha. This is verse 17 to 42 is where we're at. 17 says, does not mention the name of Simon the Cyrenian. Does it? No, I don't see that. It just says, and he bearing his cross went forth to a place called the place of the skull, which is in Hebrew tongue Golgotha. So it doesn't even mention Simon in this account. And it doesn't mean it didn't happen, just means that it wasn't mentioned. Verse 18, they crucified him with 2 thieves, one on either side. Verse 19, just slight variation, Jesus, King of the Jews. The Jews got all bent out of shape in verses 20 to 22 and said, no, don't say it's King of the Jews, but that he said he was King of the Jews. They got all upset with Pilate. And Pilate's response, I love it. He says, what I have written, I have written. And he's like, I'm not changing it. I'm going to leave it like it is. There's no mention of what the thief said or what Jesus said to the thief. We don't get any mention of the 6th hour to the 9th hour stuff. And we do not get the mention of what Jesus said, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. But we do get a slightly different take and a conversation. Verses 26 and 27, he looks at John. We don't see that by name, but it says, verse 26, when Jesus therefore saw his mother and the disciple standing, whom he loved. Of course, he loved them all, but John always referred to himself as the disciple whom Jesus loved, so we know it was John. He said to his mother, woman, behold thy son. Said the disciple, behold thy mother. And from that hour, that disciple took her unto his own home. Then, Jesus died on the cross, verses 28 and down. He does say, I thirst, which is different from any other gospel. And then before he died, we find out what he actually said when he cried with a loud voice for the last time. Verse 30, he said, it is finished. It is finished. The Greek for that phrase, you remember from Awanas? We did this in Awanas Wednesday night. Tetelestai. Tetelestai is a Greek phrase that means the debt has been paid. And that's what he was saying as he died. The debt for the sin of the world has been paid. And he bowed his head and gave up the ghost. And then there's some other kind of new information about they didn't want to break his leg, or they didn't need to break his legs because they could tell he was already dead. They put the spear in his side, and water and blood came out, and they realized he was already dead. I want to get down to, let's see, did I skip it? Let's go back to verse 25. I skipped it, I think. Yeah, verse 25. This is interesting. This is where everybody loses their mind. So, verse 25 said, there stood by the cross of Jesus his mother and his mother's sister, Mary the wife of Cleophas, and Mary Magdalene. Now, to put this in context, because I've studied this out, this would be like, so I had a grandfather and he had a brother, right? And I could say, Standing there with me was my grandfather and his brother, Tip, the wife of Viola, and Red. How many people am I talking about? If I said, there stood by me my grandfather and his brother, Tip, the wife of Viola, and Uncle Red. Talking about two people,
Yeah, two.
right?
Yep.
Well, that's what this is saying. And this is where people get uneasy. Because this is saying, there stood by the cross of Jesus his mother and his mother's sister, two people. And then he mentions them specifically by name. Mary, the wife of Cleopas. That's Jesus' mother. And her sister is Mary Magdalene. I looked up the Greek for sister there. It's not talking about biological sister. It's talking about sister in the faith or affectionate, close relationship. So, who was Mary the wife of? Cleopas. That's where everybody's like, I don't buy it. That's what it says. Cleopas is also known as Cleopas, which was one of the men on the road to Emmaus, where Jesus shows up and is talking to him, and he's like, what manner of talk is this? And Cleopas turns to Jesus and says, are you a stranger around here? Do you not know what's been going on? That's Cleopas in this verse. Which is weird, because that means Cleopas, and Mark is the account, was talking to Jesus, his, what would that be, half-stepson or something? And Jesus, of course, knew who he was, but he didn't know who Jesus was, yet he was his mother's husband.
What happened to Joseph?
Well, he died at some point, obviously. And this is what's...
I thought that was him over there.
And this is what's unsettling for everybody is like, when did she get remarried? And Jewish custom does permit that if a woman who is, of an older age gets to the point really of any age, if a woman loses her husband, that her sister's husband can take her in as another wife kind of thing, which is probably what the case was. I mean, it's a little less unsettling to think of it that way. It's just a Jewish custom that she needed somebody to take care of her. So she took someone took her to be his wife, which was a guy named Cleopas.
Which was probably Joseph's brother.
Which is probably Joseph's brother or something that took her in.
Yeah, that's the family, takes care of the family.
Right.
But then Jesus told John to take care of her.
But then Jesus also told John to take care of her as well. So it's a little bit of a what? I mean, it's just weird that we learn that through reading these passages. But this is talking about two women. Mary, the wife of Cleopas, is Mary, the mother of Jesus, James and Joseph, and Simon and whatever the other guy's name was. We don't even know. That's kind of sad. And Mary Magdalene. And then that's when he does say to John, behold your mother, behold your son. And then he says, it is finished in verse 30. They didn't break his legs. Just kind of moving on, because we're about out of time here. But we learn in verses 38 to 42 of Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus in verse 39 is mentioned, which came to Jesus by night, which is confirmed by John chapter 3, the most famous verse in the Bible. For God so loved the world, that conversation. It says in John 3:2 that Nicodemus came by night. And then verse 41 gives us some insight that tells us that the garden tomb and Golgotha are right beside each other. If you go and read verse 41 there, it says, in the place where he was crucified, there was a garden. And in the garden, a new sepulchre, wherein never man yet laid. So we know that Golgotha and the tomb were right there in the same space. And there's a church built over all that now called the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is the place where he was crucified and the place where he was buried. And that's where the empty tomb is today. That opens up a whole nother conversation that we don't have time for. But that's the comparison of all four Gospels and the journey of Golgotha itself. Anybody got any last thoughts while we have 1 or 2 minutes?
I wonder if the reason their accounts were different of what was happening on the cross. It was probably so chaotic
Absolutely.
and so loud. How could they really tell what, as far as the prisoners were that were being
Sure.
crucified with him? How could they tell what they were saying
And keeping in mind
and what
this,
he was saying to them?
the earliest written account of this was 30 years later. I mean, I'm sure they didn't forget anything, but I mean, they're trying to hit the high points of the things that stuck out to them. Of course, they're being led by the Holy Spirit to write it. But again, there's no inconsistencies, there's just simply variations in the story, which I like because you can get the full story that way and piece it all together. Kind of cool. Wish we had more time to talk about that, but that's a lot of neat stuff. And I encourage you to study all that out this week. Yes, sir.
You talked about the brother of Jesus, James, in the book of James.
Yes, that's
I
him.
was reading that he always, when you talk to young people, he says, if you want a book to follow that tells you how to live your life today, the book of James is that
Yes.
book. And I'm thinking about, well, how is this young person going to turn out when he gets older?
Right.
It's based on his decisions.
That's
If
exactly
he makes
right.
wrong decisions, he's headed that way. If he makes right decisions, he's headed in the right direction.
Absolutely.
So decisions are key.
Yeah. So, good stuff. All right, we'll close out. For those online, we'll see you all next week for Resurrection Sunday. Hope you have a great week.